I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of my colleagues at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, I'm delighted to welcome everyone here to the final installment of this fall's lecture in our online lecture series. My name is Lynn Ransom, and I am the curator of programs here at the Schoenberg Institute. Today's lecture, presented by Dr. Federico Botana, marks the end of this fall's lecture. And for those of you who may have missed our previous ones, including previous ones this fall, Dot Porter and Lisa Fagan Davis's lecture, Medieval Roles in a Digital Environment in September, and Judith Olsawi-Schlonger's presentation of her project, The Hebrew Paleography Album, a new tool for the study of Hebrew scripts in the digital age, that was given in October. You can find these recordings as well as all the recordings from our previous lectures on the SIMS YouTube channel playlist, and we're going to post a link to that in the chat in just a minute. In February of next year, we will pick up the online lecture series again, and I'll be announcing the spring lineup in the next installment of the SIMS newsletter, and as well as on our regular listservs. If you're interested in following updates on the series and our other events, I strongly encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter if you haven't already. You can do this by visiting our website at schoenberginstitute.org, where you can also find more information about our other events and programs, including our Visiting Research Fellowship, which we will be announcing the call for applications in the spring. So I urge you to pay attention to that. And also about our journal, Manuscript Studies, the current issue of which features an article by today's speaker, and I can show you our beautiful cover. Again, an image that was taken from Dr. Botana's article. I do want to remind you that we are recording this lecture and we will be posting it to the YouTube channel in the next week or so after we edit the captions. We will be taking questions at the end, and if you have questions along the way, please go ahead and type them in the chat. And at the end of the lecture, we'll pass those questions along to our speaker. You are also, of course, welcome to ask your question directly at the end. And if you'd like to do that, we ask you to use the raise hand icon to let us know that you have a question, and then you can unmute yourself and ask it. I'd like to turn now to the reason we are all here, and that is the lecture presented by Dr. Federico Botana. Dr. Botana is currently a fellow of the Institute for English Studies at the University of London. As an art historian, his research has focused on Italian late medieval and Renaissance illuminated manuscripts. His research in this area has culminated in his monograph, Learning Through Images in the Italian Renaissance, Illustrated Manuscript, and Education in Quattrocento Florence, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. More recently, thanks to his work on the Cultivate Manuscript project at the Institute for English Studies, his attentions have turned to the trade of manuscripts in Italy in the early decades of the 20th century, a rabbit hole, if you will, from which he has yet to find an exit. As I mentioned, his article entitled Temero de Marinis, Vittorio Forti, and the Acquisition of Islamic Manuscripts for J.P. Morgan in Constantinople in 1913 has just been published in Manuscript Studies. The article considers the complex and often suspect methods used in the book trade through the example of de Marinis and Forti and their business dealings with a wealthy and acquisitive client. Not just a work of scholarship, it's also a very entertaining story. While navigating his way through the above-mentioned rabbit hole, Dr. Botana stumbled across the topic of his talk today, and that is the quite amazing card index of the Italian bookseller Leo S. Olschki. Olschki sold, as many of us know, to American libraries and private collectors. And so these cards have significant implications for our understanding of the history of collecting in the States and offer a rare glimpse into the workings of a bookseller. I'm sure we're all very excited to hear what you have found, Federico, and so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. That was a very kind and very nice introduction. Now, I'll start by sharing the screen first. Let's see how it works. Oh, sorry, I haven't done it, no?
You have the share screen icon.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. There. And now I have to maximize this.
Perfect.
Sorry for that. Done.
Perfect.
Thank you. Before everything, I just want to thank you, the Schoenberg Institute, and especially you, Lynn, Nick, Herman, and Mitch, for having me there. And it was wonderful to be able to work on the manuscripts in the Kislak Center, and also to be able to go to Baltimore to look at manuscripts in the Walters. I also want to thank people working in the Kislak Center in the library, especially Eric Dialogue and John Pollock, and also those who received me at the Walters and were so kind to me, notably Lindley Herbert, the curator of rare books and manuscripts, Abigail Quant, senior conservator, Anna Clarkson, librarian archivist, and very especially Orsolia Medniansky, Zanvil Krieger curatorial fellow, who was extremely helpful with facilitating material to me when I was there. Now, let's start the paper. Before the invention of computers, the card index was a fundamental tool to almost every profession. Public relations, for example, used cards to record basic information such as names, addresses, and phone numbers, to which they added notes every time something significant happened to the titular of the card. In public libraries, the catalogs that were made available to readers were usually card indices, and card indices naturally played a central role in the book trade. A 19th century German manual for book dealers, the Lehrbuch des Deutschen Buchhandels, advises that when a book enters the firm, a detailed description should be recorded on an individual card, as well as the book succession number, storage place, and sale price. Moreover, a space is to be left on the card for updating information on commercial matters. A rare survivor, the card index of Leo Olschki, has come down to us to shed light on the practices of book dealers of the old days. Leo Samuel Olschki, better known today as a publisher, was one of the most successful antique book dealers of the 20th century. Hundreds of manuscripts today in public libraries in the United States were traded by Olschki at some point or another. The Walters Art Museum in Baltimore is top of the list, with 155 manuscripts acquired from Olschki, including the humanistic Neapolitan manuscript of Virgil's work on the left, and the early 16th century French Book of Hours on the right. The Morgan Library in New York, if my calculations are right, owns 51 manuscripts obtained from Olschki, including the late medieval Neapolitan religious miscellany on the left and the 14th century French lectionary on the right. The University of Pennsylvania owns at least 14 manuscripts known to have passed through Olschki's hands, including the 14th century Italian manuscript of Ockham's Summa on the left and the early 16th century Venetian Dogale on the right. Manuscripts that were traded by Olschki at some point or another can be found in institutions all over the United States. Berkeley, Columbia, the Library of Congress, Harvard, the Newberry, Princeton, the Public Library of New York, and Yale are just a few in the list. With the card indices of Ulrico Höpli and Giuseppe Martini, the card index of Leo Olschki is one of three to have survived from the golden age of the Italian antiquarian book trade. Known in Italian as the Schiario Olschki, it contains detailed information on books and manuscripts sold by the firm Leo S. Olschki from the 1890s until the 1970s. As I shall demonstrate, Olschki's cards can reveal when a manuscript was acquired by the firm, how long it remained unsold, to whom it was sold, for how much, and also the price paid by Olschki for the manuscript. Olschki's cards not only shed light on trading practices, they can offer us rare glimpses on key moments of inquiry and even discovery. I will begin this lecture with a few words on Leo Olschki and his firm, to continue by discussing the various types of information that can be extracted from Olschki's cards. I will first describe the index, the cards, and their contents, and I will continue by showing what the cards can reveal about manuscripts today in the United States, focusing on those in the special collections of the University of Pennsylvania libraries at the Kislak Center in Philadelphia, and those in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. I will then demonstrate how the knowledge gained from the cards can help us deciphering Olschki's annotations in the manuscripts themselves. To finish with some new insights on the functions of the cards. As a matter of conclusion, I will summarize my points to highlight the reasons why making the index digitally available online will be a significant contribution to various fields of study, not only to the history of the book trade, but also to art history, literary studies, philology, and many other disciplines. The famous Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio described Leo Olschki as the prince of book dealers and the rightful heir to the wisdom and shrewdness of Vespasiano da Bisticci, supplier of books to Renaissance rulers and known for centuries as the king of book dealers. Leo Samuel Olschki was born in Johannesburg, then East Prussia, in 1861. His father was a printer typographer specialized in Talmudic text. In 1881, after completing his secondary schooling, he was engaged as apprentice in S. Calvary & Co., an academic bookshop in Berlin. He was quickly promoted to assistant. However, he decided to move to Italy, apparently because of health problems. In 1883, he obtained a position in an antique bookshop in Verona, the Libreria Munster, and 3 years later, in 1886, he opened his own shop, also in Verona. The circumstances could not be more propitious. The law passed in 1866 had given Italian public libraries and museums the powers to obtain every manuscript and incunabulum from the libraries of suppressed religious congregations. To this must be added the still ongoing dispersion of libraries of aristocratic families. Public institutions could neither afford nor accommodate such volume of material, and all this naturally benefited book dealers and private collectors. By 1890, as this register shows, Olschki was already building a prestigious international clientele, which included institutions like the British Museum, and also collectors and scholars like William Arthur Coppinger in Manchester, the Duc de Rivoli in Paris, and Rudolf August Whithouse in New York. Indeed, by the late 1880s, Verona had become, in Olschki's own, too small for him. So in 1890, he transferred his headquarters to Venice, and in 1897 to Florence, which attracted affluent foreigners in greater numbers than Venice, and where the firm is still based today. By 1900, the firm had already a branch in Rome, and by 1919, a branch in Geneva. Olschki's beginnings as a publisher go back to 1886, when he founded l'Alighieri, a journal dedicated to the study of Dante. In 1899, he founded La Bibliophilia, which still runs today. Since its beginnings, La Bibliophilia counted amongst its contributors eminent scholars like Léopold de Lille and Henri Aumont. Olschki developed one of the most successful enterprises to ever combine luxury publishing with academic rigor, Early examples include the 1911 monumental edition of Dante's Commedia and the influential study on Florentine illumination by Paolo d'Ancona, published in 1914. After World War I, his second and third sons, Cesare and Aldo, began to gradually take control of the business. By the late 1920s, the antiquarian section was mainly operating from Geneva, and in 1938, forced by the racial laws imposed by the fascist government, Leo permanently settled in Geneva, where he died in 1940. The firm was inherited by his sons, and later his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and continued trading in rare books and manuscripts until the late 1970s. The publishing house is still today in the hands of a family and has remained one of the most important publishers in the humanities in Italy and internationally. Between 1886 and 1838, Olschki published 117 catalogues. In the 1892 transactions of the Bibliographical Society, Coppinger referred to Olschki's latest catalogue as remarkable, not only because of the number and quality of the merchandise, but also for the careful way in which the descriptions and collations of the book's catalogue have been given. In fact, Olschki introduced to Italian sale catalogues the bibliographical rigor he learned as an apprentice book dealer in Germany. In addition to sale catalogues, in 1892, he started publishing the Bulletin mensuel des derniers achats de la librairie Leo S. Olschki, a monthly bulletin listing new acquisitions. The sale catalogue is the most basic tool for researching the history of the book trade. However, with Olschki, we encounter two problems. The first is that only a few public libraries have kept these catalogues. The second is that his catalogues typically do not list manuscripts in a separate section and lack an index. Olschki's catalogues were often compiled around themes. For example, Histoire de l'Empire Ottoman, published in 1903, Musique, published in 1908, and the series Choix des livres rares, anciens et curieux, launched before 1905 and dedicated mostly to Incunabula, but also to subjects such as machines, medicine, geography, and liturgy. The only catalogue including just manuscripts, as far as I know, is Catalogue 74, Manuscript sur Vélin, published in 1910. Because of these reasons, Olschki's card index is a precious source of information. As far as I know, the Schedario Olschki is the most important card index of a book trading firm operating in the early 20th century that has come down to us, at least in Europe. Hoeple's index, by contrast, consists of clippings from catalogues published by his firm, and Martinez cards contain detailed descriptions of manuscripts and books and bibliographical references, all written by himself. In comparison, Olschki's card index is far richer in terms of variety and information. In the absence of catalogues, Olschki's index is a very useful tool. What is more, it contains information usually not included in catalogues. The Schedario was acquired in the 1980s by the Soprintendenza ai Beni Librai della Regione Toscana, which we might translate as superintendence to the book heritage of the region of Tuscany, and is now the property of the Giunta Regionale della Toscana, Regional Council of Tuscany. It consists of 3 all-file cabinets, which together contain 81 drawers. If we consider that each drawer contains between 300 and 700 cards, and that more than one card was often used to describe a single book, we can conclude that the total number of entries is somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000. I have already examined all the drawers and found 565 entries for manuscripts. The number is surprisingly low, since I have records for at least 200 more manuscripts traded by Olschki. For instance, at least 90 books of hours are not represented in the index, and very passingly, the section on Dante does not include any manuscripts. It is reasonable to assume that a large part of the index was destroyed, since the firm's headquarters and 2 Florentine shops were severely damaged in 1944. Cards are arranged alphabetically into sections by author, and sections are subdivided by titles. In the absence of a known author, they are filed just by title or typology, and even by names of places. For example, Biblia, Orae, Salterium, Trattato, Firenze, Venezia, and so forth. Most of the cards are made of Bristol paper and measure about 100 by 120 millimeters. In fact, the Lehrbuch des Deutschen Buchhandels recommends durable paper and the size of a German postcard. Most of the cards are written by hand. I have identified 15 different hands, but so far I have been able to name only 3. Leo Olschki, his son Cesare, and Tamaro de Marinis, the illustrious Neapolitan book dealer and scholar who worked with Olschki between 1900 and 1904 before establishing his own successful firm. A very plausible candidate for the oldest cards is Fritz Mielke, who worked with Olschki between 1900 and 1904 before, Fritz Mielke, who worked as a cataloger for Olschki in the 1890s. Type cards were introduced in the 1920s. Some cards are pasted with clippings from sale catalogs, either Olschki's or other dealers, Sotheby's in particular. Like in Olschki's sale catalogs, most entries are written in French. Italian and English seem to have been used more frequently after 1930. The amount of detail included in each entry varies greatly. In some instances, we have just 2 sentences on the erector of a card. In others, we discover densely written double cards folded and pinned together to form booklets of up to 12 pages. The contents of each card might be divided into main text and marginal annotations. The main text consists of a description of the manuscript. It contains basic information such as title, date, place of origin, material, book size, number of leaves, descriptions of the binding, and if there are any, decoration and illustrations. It might also include transcriptions of incipits, chapter headings, notes by readers, names of previous owners, and bibliographical references. One of the main functions of the cards, as recommended in the Lehrbuch, was to serve as drafts for catalog entries. An example is the set of cards for this book of hours, now in the Walters. On the right, we see the entry for the manuscript in Catalog 74. On the left, the corresponding cards. The text drafted on the cards was reproduced in the catalog, including corrections and additions. Amongst the marginal annotations, we discovered the accession numbers, usually, but not always, written by the same person who wrote the main text. Supposedly, they were crossed out when the manuscript was sold, but this did not always happen. Accession numbers are key pieces of information. For example, in the case of these 2 manuscripts, which are today in Payne Library's special collections, the manuscript on the left is a miscellany containing the Rule of St. Jerome, and the manuscript on the right, a miscellany including Petrarca's Alphabetum Malarum Mulierum. They were both produced in Italy in the 15th century. These are the corresponding cards, which demonstrate that the manuscript passed through Olschki's hands. The accession number for the rule is 25,193, which indicates the manuscript was obtained by Olschki around 1902. The accession number for the alphabetum, 28,296, suggests it was acquired by Olschki around 1906. Accession numbers, which were allocated to a book as it entered the firm, can reveal, at least approximately, when Olschki obtained the manuscript. I have established this chronology based on the higher accession numbers in catalogs, invoices, and correspondence. Cards were also annotated with numbers preceded by letters, which can be associated with other branches of the company and even other business ventures. Books with numbers preceded by the letter G were traded in the Geneva branch. Those with numbers preceded by an R, we might presume, were sold in the Roman branch. 16 cards, in addition to the 5 digits serial accession number, include a shorter number preceded by the letters OR, sometimes written in ink, sometimes in pencil, and probably added later. These manuscripts, as revealed by 2 letters in the historical archive of the Publishing Society Leo S. Olschki in Florence, were owned in partnership by Leo Olschki and his friend, the Munich book dealer Jack Rosenthal. This has been corroborated by my colleague Angeline Reyes, who discovered in the archives in Munich a list of books co-owned by Rosenthal and other dealers, including at least 120 items traded in partnership with Olschki. 3 of the surviving cards include numbers preceded by the letters OER. These letters stand for Olschki Erwin Rosenthal and were assigned to manuscripts co-owned by Olschki and Erwin, Jack Rosenthal's son, who in 1910 married Olschki's youngest daughter, Margherita, becoming Olschki's son-in-law. This can be verified in the personal accounts book kept by Olschki in the 1920s, preserved today in the archive of the publishing house. This little book, a mine of information, contains accounts relating to 20 items referred to by the number OER, which usually occur in pages headed Rosenthal, Dr. Erwin, München. Annotations also include sale prices, as recommended in the Lehrbuch, usually written in pencil. Before World War I, prices were recorded in French francs, and after the mid-1920s in gold lire, Swiss francs, and occasionally in British pounds, like in Olschki's catalogs. It is important to note that at the time, Belgian, French, and Swiss francs and Italian lire were paired 1-to-1. The so-called Latin monetary union. The parity, which started in 1867 and ended in the mid-20s, continued into the 1930s between gold lire and Swiss francs. When we compare the prices of a manuscript, when we compare the prices of a manuscript in a card with those in sale catalogs and the Bulletin Mensuel, they usually match. For example, this Evangeliary, now in the Walters, offered for 8,000 francs. But on some occasions, prices do not match. Even more, cards are sometimes annotated with different prices, even in different currencies. But this is sometimes a result of inflation. An example is this set of cards described in the missal. The accession number 26,019 verifies it was bought before 1905. But the inscription Kors reveals it was still with Olschki in 1926, when a new shop on the Lungarno Corsini in Florence was opened. The card includes 2 prices, 200 crossed out and 1,000 lire. In 1905, the equivalent of 200 francs was 8 pounds, and in 1926, the equivalent of 1,000 lire was 10 pounds. Thus, it would seem the price of this manuscript was adjusted for inflation. Annotations can also reveal how much Olschki paid for a manuscript. In the card on the left, describing a brief breviary from the collection of the Earl of Kilmorey, we read costo 2,800 lire. In the card on the right, describing a Bible sold to J.P. Morgan around 1910, we read costo lire 7,050. These are the only cards including purchase prices written in numbers I have found so far, but they also contain sequences of capital letters. These are, in fact, the same prices written in code, and similar letter sequences recur throughout the index. It was custom and practice amongst book dealers and collectors to use codes to keep secret records of the prices they pay for their books. These codes were often based on words, usually 10 letters long, which had a particular meaning for the possessors. Together with Peter Kidd, we succeeded in deciphering Olschki's code. It then appeared that the code was based on the German noun Zuversicht. For those who are familiar with Olschki's personality, the choice is obvious. Zuversicht can be translated as confidence that something or someone shall achieve success in the future. His favorite motto, which we find in the ex libris designed for him in 1902, was nil difficile volenti. It can be translated as nothing is difficult for the one who is determined. Names of buyers are sometimes noted on the cards. This happened more frequently after 1920. An early example is the card for a 14th century English manuscript of Giles of Rome's Livre du Gouvernement des Princes, which was annotated in pencil Verkauf an Walters, sold to Walters, as it happened in 1914. Olschki, however, is not included in the provenance chains of this manuscript, neither in the online Walters catalog, nor he was in the Schoenberg database until I created an entry for the card. This takes me to the third subject of this lecture. What can we learn from the cards about the manuscripts traded by Olschki that are now in American collections? First of all, the most obvious, a description in a card can be used to verify if a particular manuscript was traded by Olschki. An example is this Venetian manuscript today in Philadelphia. It consists of an illuminated copy of the instructions given in 1525 by Andrea Gritti, then Doge of Venice, to Niccolò Tiepolo, Podestà, that is head magistrate of the city of Brescia, then under Venetian control. The only provenance information we discover in Open is that the manuscript was sold to the University of Pennsylvania in 1960 by Bernard Lesnick. The information recorded on the card, notably the number of folios, the description of the illuminated border on the first page, and the names of the Doge and the Podestà and the date, allow us to identify this manuscript as the same now in Philadelphia. Moreover, the accession number 18,735 indicates that Olschki acquired this manuscript about 1898, when his company was still based in Venice, which might lead to further discoveries. An interesting case is provided by the manuscripts co-owned and traded in partnership by Jacques Rosenthal and Olschki that are now in the Walters. For the Evangeliary MSW31, there is no mention of Rosenthal in the provenance information in the richest census of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in the United States. Nor there is for this 15th century Northern Italian breviary, now MSW332. Nor for this late 14th century manuscript of John Climacus' Scala Paradisi, now MSW157. The case of MSW144, Le Livre du Gouvernement des Princes, is even more puzzling. According to the Rich's census, Walters obtained the manuscript from the Paris bookseller and binder Léon Gruel, but according to the card, it was co-owned by Olschki and Rosenthal. There is no mention of this manuscript in the file of Gruel's correspondence at the Walters. If the Ricci was right, Gruel might have acted as an intermediary for practical reasons. For example, Gruel might have been asked to restore the binding before sending the manuscript to Walters. Cards can give us a hint of how much a North American client paid Olschki for a manuscript. This can be very useful for manuscripts that cannot be found in Olschki's surviving sale catalogs, and even more for those sold to Henry Walters, since he's known for destroying proofs of expenditure. As to whether North American collectors pay the same prices as those noted on the cards, the answer is yes, more often than not. Olschki rarely offered discounts, and when he did, these did usually not exceed 20%. According to the card for the Scala Paradisi, Walters paid 5,000 lire for the manuscript, the same price noted in the lower margin in francs, presumably the shop price. The card for this late 15th century Italian breviary, now MSW 333, is marked 4,000 francs. The card for this 13th century French Psalter, now MSW 114, is marked 6,000 francs. My last example, of which unfortunately I do not have a photo, is a 13th century French Bible, which was sold to Walters in 1927 and is now MSW 61. The price on the corresponding card is 50,000, then presumably Swiss francs. With the code decipher, we can calculate the markup for each manuscript. The examples I will now show were all acquired by Olschki after 1907, advertised for sale in his catalog 74 in 1910, and were bought by Walters before 1912. My first example is a 13th century French Bible, now MSW 123. The card is annotated ZTTTT, which corresponds to a purchase price of 10,000, either Italian lire or francs. The price in the catalog 74 is 25,000, corresponding to the purchase price multiplied by 2.5. So the markup here is 90%. The card for the 15th century Florentine breviary, now MSW 334, is noted RTT, thus 5,000 francs. The manuscript was advertised for 20,000 francs, so 4 times the purchase price, thus with a markup of 300%. The card for a 15th century Italian manuscript of Juvencus's Carmina, now MSW 347, is marked ZRT, so 150. It was advertised for 750, that is 5 times the purchase price and with a markup of 400%. The card for a 14th century Psalter, now MS 150, is annotated EDT, so 400. It was advertised for 2,500, so 6.25 times the purchase price, which corresponds to a markup of 525%. The knowledge provided by the index helps us interpreting information found in other sources and even in the objects themselves, notably in the manuscripts sold by Olschki to Henry Walters. Olschki noted purchase prices in code on the backs of book covers. These were usually erased, but not always, and often not completely. On the verso of the top cover of these 14th century Italian manuscripts containing moral works then attributed to Seneca and Cicero, we discover the letters VIR, half erased, indicated that Olschki paid 375 lire or francs for the manuscript. It was advertised in Catalog 74 for 2,000 francs, so 5.3 times the purchase price, and it was bought by Walters before 1912. It also includes a clipping from an Italian catalog, which suggests Olschki obtained the manuscript in Italy. Another example is this 14th century French manuscript containing Averroes' Liber de Medicina and Pseudo-Seneca de Quator Virtutibus. It was sold by Olschki to Walters sometime after 1912. In the verso of the back cover, we find Olschki's selling price, 1,900 lire, noted in blue pencil as he usually did. In the verso of the front cover, we discover half erased the letters CRT, indicating that Olschki paid for this manuscript 850 francs. Dr. Reis established that this manuscript was sold by Jacques Rosenthal to Olschki in 1905. The price in Rosenthal's last sale catalog advertising the manuscript is 875 marks. At the time, 850 francs or lire were worth about 690 marks. So Rosenthal appears to have offered Olschki a 20% discount. If Olschki recorded the price in marks, then a mere discount of 3%, which I doubt because CRT is not preceded by an M. Now, if we look at the upper left corner, we discover two sequences of capital letters. They include M, A, and N, and F, which are not included, which do not form part of Olschki's code. In fact, their price is written in Jacques Rosenthal's code, which was based on his own surname plus the first initial. The sequence AHN comes to 875, corresponding to the selling price in Rosenthal's catalog. So the M must stand for marks, since it's not included in his secret code, and the F not included in his code either for francs. In fact, RTT, which with Rosenthal's code can be deciphered as 1166, roughly corresponds to the equivalent in francs of 875 marks at the time. Thus, Rosenthal used his code also to note selling prices, as Olschki occasionally did too, especially after 1925. These notes were not the only surprises I encountered during my visit to the Walters 3 weeks ago. Orsholia Medniansky revealed to me the existence of two sets of cards scattered across the curatorial files for the manuscript bought from Olschki. The first set of cards, with little doubt, was produced in Olschki's headquarters in Florence. This card was written by a hand whom I have named O1. This person was probably Fritz Milke, whom I have mentioned before. This card was written by a person who wrote cards for Olschki for more than 30 years, whose identity is still a mystery to me, and whom I have named Hand 03. This other hand also appears in the index in Florence, but much less frequently than Hands 01 and 03. This card was written by Leo Olschki himself. By contrast, I have not seen hand 4. The style of the handwriting, however, and the note Leave 2, Scaff 1, that is bookcase 2, shelf 1, are typical of Olschki's cards. The curatorial files also include cards typed in blue, like those found in the index in Florence, which became more frequent after 1920. The files also contain cards pasted with clippings from Olschki's catalogs. As you can see, prices were carefully cut off. These clippings were probably sent to Walters by Olschki, in some occasions glued to letters like the one on the right. So we may presume that handwritten cards were also sent with the manuscripts. But Olschki's cards acquire new functions in the Walters Art Gallery. Some cards were stamped with numbers. As suggested to me by Dr. Mediansky, the numbers correspond to those in the so-called list circa 1912. The list included manuscripts sold by Olschki to Walters before 1912. It was used by the Ricci to compile the census and is today nowhere to be found. It would seem that Olschki's cards provided the basic information for a second set of cards, even though, with one exception, they are written in French. These cards were most probably not produced at Olschki's headquarters. They are in a different format, and the style of handwriting is very different from that of Olschki's employees. So far, I have discovered two possible candidates: James C. Anderson, who worked for the Walters as superintendent to the building and the collections, and Faris Chapel Pete, an antiques dealer who was employed by Walters as curator from 1909 until Pete's death in 1922. I am more inclined towards Pete for the simple reason that there are remarkable graphological similarities between these cards and letters written by Pete, now in the archives of the American Numismatic Society in New York and available online. I am not going to dwell on this now, since it certainly requires further verification. Returning to Olschki's cards in the Walters, they have helped me discovering another function for the cards which are still in Florence. 5 of the cards typed in blue in the Walters have counterparts written by Hando III in Florence. After a simple comparison of the handwritten cards in the upper row with their type counterparts below, it is reasonable to conclude that the first set served as a model for the second. The cards by Hando I and Hando III in the Walters describe manuscripts acquired by Walters before 1912. Olschki's employees, as attested to by letters in the archive of a publishing house in Florence, started using typewriters only in the late 1910s. So these cards, like those typed in blue, might have been produced especially to be sent to clients. Unlike the handwritten cards I have shown in the previous slides, these ones do not have any corrections. Returning to Olschki's cards in Florence, those with corrections and additions are, in my view, the most interesting. They attest to collaboration amongst members of Olschki's team and also to the processes of drafting and editing catalog entries, and more importantly, to a scholarly inquiry and even moments of discovery. For example, the description of these books of hours, now in the Walters, was first drafted by Hando III. Olschki made additions, which were in turn corrected by that person. In the version published in Catalog 74, we can see further corrections that were made before the text was printed. The cards written by Tamaro de Marinis are particularly interesting. He was about 20 when he entered the firm and was still learning the trade. His cards are usually full of corrections and additions. The card for this manuscript of Salus is a good example. The manuscript was produced in Florence in the mid-15th century and is now in the Walters. In the description of the coat of arms on the first page, the name Piccolomini was crossed out and was replaced by Comte Palmieri de Sienne. On the back of the card, he wrote a note in pencil, which was erased, but can still be read. Vedi or veda nell'inventario della libreria Piccolomini pubblicato dal Favre e dallo Everard se vien citato questo emes, which can be translated as check in the inventory of the Piccolomini library published by Fabre and Evrard if this manuscript happens to be cited. We may assume it was not cited. Some cards attest to breakthroughs in scholarship. This is the card for the De Braille's Bible, now in the Bodleian in Oxford, which was sold by Olschki to Charles William Dyson Perrins in 1915. In the top margin, we can read the addition d'origine indubitablement anglaise, that is, undoubtedly of English origin. As pointed out to me by Father Smith, who has conducted research on the manuscript, this was probably the first instance in which the Bible was referred to as English. To conclude, I shall now summarize my points to highlight the reasons why making Leo Olschki's cards digitally available online will be an important contribution to scholarship, not only for those researching the history of the book trade, but also for our historians, literary scholars, philologists, cultural historians, librarians, and many other disciplines. First of all, the descriptions in cards allow us to verify if a manuscript passed through Olschki's hands. This is particularly important since only a few of the manuscripts traded by Olschki can be found in sale catalogs. Moreover, many of the manuscripts described in the cards cannot either be found today in public libraries. The cards can indeed reveal that a previously unknown manuscript once existed, and might even help us investigating whether this manuscript is today in the hands of a private collector or has simply been lost. Accession numbers, first of all, help identifying a manuscript. They are particularly useful for books of hours and other serially produced books, but they have other uses. They can serve to establish when approximately Olschki acquired a manuscript, and even how long it took to sell. For example, this 16th century manuscript was bought by the University of Pennsylvania in 1957. However, the accession number on Olschki's ex libris, 47,428, indicates he acquired the manuscript about 1937, and thus remained sold for 20 years. Combined with accession numbers, references to storage places can help us also establishing how long a manuscript remained unsold. As with this missal, which was purchased around 1905 and was still in the firm after 1926. Selling prices are important, first of all, for understanding the dynamics of the market, and second, for finding the manuscripts that were preferred above others by collectors and librarians at particular times in history. When we have several prices on the same card, like here, we can not only verify how long the manuscript remained unsold, but also establish whether its value remained stable. Purchase prices are important, not only for the reasons cited above, but also for understanding the inner workings of the market. Inner workings of a trade. And of course, names of previous owners and names of buyers are precious pieces of information. Some cards are even annotated with the names of potential clients who viewed the manuscripts, and a few with the names and the dates of the exhibitions where the manuscripts were shown. Of course, all this information can be transcribed and made available online as searchable text. In fact, I have already created entries in the Schoenberg database for all the manuscripts traded by Olschki, which are now in Penn libraries and in the Walters in Baltimore. And I have already started with the Morgan. But images tell stories which cannot be told in words, or at least cannot be captured into a single linear story. This is certainly the case for the cards that contain many corrections and additions. They present us with visual narratives open to interpretation, and it is our duty as scholars to interpret them in every possible way. We may ponder, for instance, to what extent the young de Marinis was learning a trade of his own, and to what extent he was supervised by Olschki and others. The mysterious hand 03. What type of working relationship had this person with Olschki, who seemed to permit him or her to correct his draft? Or did Olschki dictate the correction, standing behind her or his back? Who told hand 03 to add undoubtedly of English origin to the description of the Hebraic Bible? Was it Olschki? Was it a scholar who wrote for La Bibliophilia? Or did hand 03 reach that conclusion on her or his own? The messy patterns on these cards are traces of human actions, of thinking, of discovery, and often of very hard and dedicated work. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Federico. That was a really impressive dissection and decoding, literally decoding of these cards. And it really turned up a lot of thoughts in my mind about how, you know, like as you say, how these cards can be used for scholarship, for tracking provenance. And it's just really exciting. I'm particularly interested, for example, in how the cards show developments in manuscript description, what the changes, what the edits mean, as his business continued, you know, through the decades. It'd be really interesting to see how that sort of plays out. And also about the visual. I completely agree about the visual, the importance of the visual aspect of these cards, because you know, we can capture this, as you say, we can capture this data in the Schoenberg database, but you really don't see the relationships of the parts of the pieces until you see the card. So hopefully that can happen. Are there any questions? I can turn this over to the audience.
Lynn, there's a comment in the chat by Barbara Huglo about how useful these annotations are to musicologists. Barbara, do you want to go ahead and do you have a question to ask, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, in addition, how many of these, I may have missed this at the beginning, how many of these cards exist? Do you have an approximate number of them?
An approximate number I got, basically the thing about the cards is that sometimes they say cards, but in fact a book can have up to 5 or 6 cards.
Yeah.
As to entries for manuscripts, so far I think it's 565. I might have a bit less, a bit more, because I think I counted them twice, but I think you need to count them a bit more. That is, I think, between half and perhaps two-thirds of what Olschki traded, but half or a third, perhaps, more likely, because yes, so it's a bit hit and miss. So some manuscripts, for example, like some manuscripts like the Conrad Bible in the Walters doesn't have a card, and there's plenty that don't have a card. So yeah. So if you want to know about antiphonals, there are plenty, but they're often very difficult to identify.
Yeah, well, it's marvelous. I hope you can digitize them, and at least, if not transcribe them, include an index.
Yeah. Thank you.
There's also a question from Francesco Siri. I don't know if Francesco would like to unmute, or I will read the question. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Francesco.
Hi, Federico. Thank you so much for your paper. I had a question on the cards and the collaborators of Leo Olschki concerning the identification that you probably that you share with us. Did you have the chance to check or compare the ends of this collaborator with some documents still preserved in the archives in Florence? And then, so maybe there are new identification that can be discovered.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. Cesare Olschki, for example, like there is a letter in the archive in the publishing house, and that helped me to identify the writing. Now, it is somewhat tricky because there was an in-house style of writing. I don't know if you know that list of manuscripts of D'Annunzio that was, I think it was published many times when Olschki sold the manuscript of D'Annunzio. That is the typical Olschki hand of the time. And there's another person, he did one card as far as I know. And then the mysterious hand of 3 wrote letters for Olschki and copied stuff and wrote in English sometimes. But I haven't been able to identify that person. I thought at the moment that again the hand is very similar to Attilio Bompani, who was director of the shop during the First World War, basically replaced Olschki during the First World War. But I'm not sure. I could be actually that I haven't. There is some graphology. I have only one letter by him, and I'm not, it could be, but I'm not sure. I think it's somebody else, basically. And who knows, but because I bet it's possible that some emerging scholars who are writing articles for La Bibliophilia, cataloging and stuff, were also doing, cataloging. This is cataloging, basically. So they were writing cards. It's a very good question. The archives, unfortunately, I don't know if you know, but they were in the basement of the shop in Florence in 1966, so very little survives.
Thank you, Federico.
There is a short question from Anna Clarkson. Anna, would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it for you?
Sure. I was just curious, for the cards that did note provenance, as a whole, could you talk about who Olschki bought materials from, where the material came from, like since you've been able to look at the grouping together and the ones that did note provenance?
I must say, hi Anna first. That's a very good question because it's very tricky. Olschki was very good at hiding his traces. So we know he bought things in Sotheby's quite often. He came here for auctions at least once a year, 2 auctions, and until mostly even in the early 1933, I think he still came to one. I don't know if it's later. So that is very easy to corroborate because, first of all, the Sotheby's catalogs have been annotated by, for example, the ones in the archives in Quaritch. You can see his name and how much he paid for things, and then the cards that are clippings, or sometimes they have the prices. You can see the prices the prices are in code, but they were in pounds because you can see the spaces for shillings and pence, the little lines. But apart from that, it is very, very hard because it never puts, basically he never wrote down from whom he bought anything. And the notes, basically just little has survived. So he had partnerships with sort of working partnerships of people that he was close to in Italy, and one was Rossi in Rome, and that's something which needs to be investigated further, because they are sort of I think they might have shared some material, and he might have got things in Rome and sent it to him, and I think there's somebody else in Venice. So he had some. I think it's something which basically can be done with a bit of work, is to follow those leads. And sometimes he went to Paris to the auctions in Drouot, and Léon Gruel too. He bought from Léon Gruel. And there is a very funny letter in the archive when he says that actually he took advantage of him, that he bought for 3,000 a book of, or something like that, a book of hours that he counts on selling for 15,000. So yeah, so there is still a lot of work to be done. That's the way. That's the answer.
Thank you.
All right, there is a question in the chat from Anka Timmerman, which I will read. Did Olschki have a reference library, personal or for the company? And if so, has it survived?
It hasn't, but there is a catalog, which I must say I never looked at. There is a catalog, a sale catalog, I think from the 1940s. Oh, Angeline, if she's around, she might be able to remember. I think there was, if I'm right, the reference library was auctioned in Geneva after his death or sold. So that's quite easy to reconstruct, yes. And also there are plenty in the card index, there are plenty of cards for books which were relatively recent and sort of a scholarly books. And so you can have a very good idea of what he was using, yes. It's a very good question, actually.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Hi, Federico. That was splendid. Thank you.
Ciao,
And thank you, Lynn,
Francesca.
and everyone. Ciao.
Thank you.
Federico, have you started working out the volume of his sales to the States in comparison with other places? Do you have an idea of how much material he sold to the States rather than to Europe or in Italy, or do you have? That would be interesting.
It's difficult to establish that because amounts of loss and because the proportion of loss still lack of information. And for example, for the cards of the 106 and 565, I think around 150 are for manuscripts that are now in the States. I think less than that. I don't remember. It's somewhere between 120 and 150. But then, of course, the cards are only is probably a third or half of what he traded. And even though I suspect that some manuscripts he didn't even write a card. As to what we can see from I think it's one of the things that one could look in the Schoenberg database. I don't remember the figure on top, but it's probably, I would say, I don't know. I don't know. What is certain is that he did sell more to the States at the beginning, around before the First World War, and then he's selling less in general, but then he's selling more to Europe. Yeah.
Grazie.
Niente.
There's a question from Abigail Quant. Abigail, do you want to reveal yourself, or shall I read your? Here she comes.
A bit dark here. Hi, everyone. No, so I'm actually very interested in this question about whether Olschki, like Leon Gorel, had a practice of having manuscripts or incunabula rebound or even repaired before he sold them. I mean, many of our incunabula that were purchased from Olschki were reinforced on the inside. A few were rebound, as we talked about during your visit. But we don't see this happening in the manuscripts that he purchased. Whereas Leon Gorel, it's clear that he rebound many of the books that were purchased by Henry Walters. So I was just curious to learn more about Olschki's firm and whether he had binders working for him and this sort of thing. Is there any information in that regard?
I must confess, that's a very good question. Thank you. And I think it was great what you told me about Olschki's manuscript when I was in the Walters, because I hadn't realized to the extent that he sent the things in more or less perfect condition. And that it is a very good question. And I must confess that I haven't investigated that further. But in the invoices I found for binders, I think there is one binder in Germany.
Okay.
And there is whose name I don't remember, but that might be sort of through the Rosenthal connection. And then there is Leon Gorel was often, for example, he got Leon Gorel to do things for Morgan before sending them.
Oh, interesting.
So I suspect that he might have had that with Walters too. And for example, for the Livre du gouvernement de France, which is really incongruous that was sold to by Gruel to Walters. It doesn't make any sense to me because of annotation in the card and because of the date. I think I read in the description on your catalog that it's an early 19th century building that it was restored in the early 20th century. So then I thought, oh, that might be the reason that Gruel might have dealt with it before it wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
That's completely hypothetical. No, it is interesting that because I really don't remember seeing any invoice from a Florentine binder. But again, that lost with the flood in 1966.
Right.
So,
yeah. Okay. I actually have just another more of a comment than a question. I'll be quick. So as you know, we are actively digitizing our manuscripts and occasionally printed books when it seems to be important to do so. And I've tried in the past to include cards that we know were actually tipped into the front of the book at the time of the sale, and then were later removed, probably by Dorothy Miner. But we haven't been very consistent about this. But I think we should, especially given all this amazing information that we obviously have in our files about Olschki. So we can discuss this further offline, but you know, I think right now, if we are digitizing a card as well as the whole manuscript, the image appears in a sort of separate section of our Ex Libris website, along with other so-called oddities. But if there is a more systematic way that we should be doing this, I mean, it's something that Anna and I could talk about too with Linley. But I think we should be doing this as part of the sort of standard practice of digitizing a whole manuscript. But if there's a particular way we need to go about, you know, describing, you know, in terms of the metadata and whatnot, what these, you know, artifacts are, and if we can reconstruct if any were tipped in, sometimes it's pretty obvious if that's helpful to scholars.
But I think it would be very helpful, particularly for those that don't know the catalogs. The catalog 74, which actually Walters bought 30 something of those catalogs. I think 30 something manuscripts of those 30 plus from this catalog. That's easy to find. But then there are plenty of others that there are no catalog entries. It's interesting to see how it was cataloged or described at the time when it was sold. It's always interesting to see that. Nowadays, we can, when we advance with the digitization of these, then we can see probably making links or something. I don't know. I'm not particularly good with that, but I think yes. And I'm very interested in. I hope somebody can check the letters of what's his name, Faris Chapel Pitt, to find out where is his writing. I'm almost sure.
Yeah, I've never heard about this person.
No, he's in.
We have his letters.
Cool.
Who?
We have some. You can message me.
That's Anna Clarkson.
But they, yes, but he was curator, so he was sort of, according to Johnston's book, he started working on and off as a curator in the early 1900s, and then became curator full-time in 1909 when he opened the gallery. And there is a bit of photo of him in the book. And he had an antique shop, an art gallery around the corner where he sold all his French paintings. So I imagine, and porcelain. So I imagine that's why the affectation of writing in French comes from that. And it seems to be an old family of Maryland.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you for all that.
Yes.
That's very important.
Well, we'll be in touch.
We'll be in touch. Yeah.
All right, there is a question from William Monroe. William, if you would like to show yourself and ask your question, otherwise I will read it.
I can't show myself because my
Okay.
working, but I would be glad to ask the question. I don't know. Yeah, I'm the curator of both our medieval manuscripts and some other early printed books. So I'm curious about incunables, especially, but you know, I'm sure, you know, since you said there are 565 cards for manuscripts, have you looked at any of the cards for incunabula, for instance? And I would think this information would also be of great interest to us. Our largest collection is the Anne Murray Brown collection, built by Rush Hawkins in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and he wasn't very interested in questions of provenance and didn't record where he bought these books. So I'd be very interested in that kind of information.
Well, I haven't counted the cards for incunabula, and I suspect there are far more than for manuscripts. No, perhaps not, because incunabula, there's a lot for early printed books, lots. I have sometimes, I learned how to avoid them when I was sort of flicking through the card. Just when you have a precise date and a place and then a name a bit German, often it's just that pass. But yes, and there's lots from the early 19th century written by the Marinis, lots. So the Marinis probably wrote more cards than anybody else at the end of the day. He worked very hard. So yes, that I think would be very important to that's somehow made also known, because there's some, even I think I did Nerida Newgiven, who's a professor of history in Australia, and who worked on all her life on religious plays from the 15th century, asked me to check what was there. And I found one of an edition that she didn't know about. So there is of an edition from it was from the 1500s, but there is plenty of things there.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There are no more questions in the chat, but does anyone want to unmute and ask a question? I also did notice that Lynn, if you go into chat and scroll up a little bit, Lynn posted in a link to Federico's work in the Schoenberg database, so you can take a look at what he's been working on there.
Yeah, so if you go to the link and then click on there's a little capsule that has a number in it, and that's the number of entries so far associated with this source. And I imagine, Federico, you'll keep adding to those.
Oh yeah, whenever I can. Yes, and I love working for the database. It's a very relaxing and very rewarding job.
And if anyone is interested in contributing, just you know where to find me. Federico, thank you. This has been really a really great way to end this fall's series. And I did neglect to mention that in the introduction that you just recently finished up a visiting research fellowship, and I think this has been a perfect example of how these fellowships can build connections for those of you traveling to Philadelphia or needing to travel to Philadelphia to do research. So I encourage you to pay attention in the coming months when I'll be making that announcement for the call for applications. Thank you to the audience for coming and for your attention. We will hopefully see you in 2023. Happy holidays and Happy New Year. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.